Center for the Ethiopian Educational Information and Communication Technology presents Educational Satellite Television Programs.
Hello, teacher. Hello, students. Welcome to today's lesson on graphing trigonometric functions. You have already learned about the basic trigonometric functions, sine, cosine, and tangent. They are used to identify the relationship between the angles of a triangle and the lengths of the sides of the triangle. But what do these functions look like on a graph? Last lesson, we learned how to graph the sine function. Today, we will learn how to graph the cosine and tangent functions. This is very similar to graphing the sine function, so it should not be too hard. Let us start with cosine. Do you remember what the cosine is? The cosine of an acute angle is the ratio of the length of the adjacent side to the length of the hypotenuse. But before we draw the graph of the cosine function, we first need to determine the cosine values. In a previous lesson, you learned how to find cosine values, which you must do before you make your graph. Do you remember how to do that? Please take a moment now to calculate the cosine values of the angles in the table on the screen. Once you have completed this activity, plot those points on a graph. Mark the values of the angle on the horizontal axis and the values of y on the vertical axis. Then draw a smooth curve between all the points. Go ahead.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up! Let's get back to our lesson.
Well done. It looks very similar to the sine function. And just like the sine function, the cosine function is periodic. That means it repeats at every 360 degrees, or 2 pi. Remember also that when a function repeats its values at regular intervals, it is called a periodic function. See the diagram that shows the sine and cosine drawn together? Both curves have the same shape, but are always exactly 90 degrees apart. So, what is the domain and range of y equals cosine theta? Well, we remember from the last lesson that the domain of the sine function is the set of all real numbers that allow the function formula to work. It is the same for the cosine function. The range is -1 to +1. And the period is 360 degrees, or 2 pi radians. Now, let us talk about the tangent function. First, I want you to complete the table of values for y equals tan theta. Then, I want you to make a graph and plot the points onto it.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up! Let's get back to our lesson.
How did it go? Now, this graph seems different, does it not? Tangent is sine divided by cosine. But at pi over 2, the number is undefined. In fact, the tangent angle is undefined for theta equals 90 degrees plus or minus n times 180 degrees. N equals 1, 2, 3. Or theta equals n times 90 degrees, n, where n is an odd integer. This makes it an asymptote. The curve in our graph heads up toward the asymptote, but never touches it. The domain is the set of theta such that theta does not equal n times 90 degrees, where n is an odd integer. The range is again the set of all real numbers, and the period of the tangent function is 180 degrees, or pi radians. And like the sine and cosine functions, because tangent is periodic, the graph can be extended to infinity. That's all for this lesson, students. We have now learned how to graph the sine, cosine, and tangent functions. You should now be able to graph each of these functions and find their domain, range, and period. Until next time, thank you, teacher. Thank you, students.